studio@connectradio.com. So we'll do 2 for 1 here, and Tom will share his faith story, but also he will answer the question, which is what many people ask: is faith a leap in the dark? Pick the bones out of that one, Tom.
I'd love to. I want to try to tell you a little story about how I discovered some things about faith, and that opened the door for me to move from not having faith to being a bit against faith, to then being a bit intrigued. And then, well, you're going to have to wait to listen to my story to find out what happened. So I used to only believe in what I could see, touch, and prove. I was definitely not a religious believer. I was very skeptical of spiritual and religious claims. I thought that Christianity, please don't be offended by this, but I thought that Christianity was for people who are too afraid to use logic and not sharp enough to ask good questions and not socially confident enough to find their way in the world. So I considered faith something that you might try to use when the reasons are stacking up against what you know deep down you ought to believe, what you ought to accept, the reality of it. Like a kind of religious wishful thinking in which you use your willpower and self-belief to squeeze out hope for yourself. But I made a big error, a big mistake. I decided to do a course about the big questions of life at university, a course in philosophy. Using a metaphor from boxing, what I expected to see as I studied philosophy, those questions that are slightly beyond physics and science, but they are real and important questions. What I expected to see was belief in God was like the previous slightly old and out of shape heavyweight boxer. And I expected to see that boxer leaning back on the ropes, staggering around, having taken a few good blows from the younger champion, the up and coming champion. But I was expecting to see probably some sort of knockout blow on the old champ. How could that person beat science? What did the old champ of religion have to say about logic and evidence? But that wasn't what I saw as I started to do my course. I actually saw large numbers of professors in secular philosophy departments who were giving robust and persuasive answers to the big questions that all human beings ask. Who are we? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there a universe? Why does that universe have its finely tuned laws and constants? Why are some things right, like standing up to bullies who invade other countries? And why are some things wrong, like targeting civilian areas with cluster bombs? Is God real? Is God really real? I also saw that there were a really good number of brilliant academics like John Lennox, Alistair McGrath, Ard Louis, Francis Collins, and even some Nobel Prize winners and leaders who were still committed to the same intellectual and logical evidence-based ideals as I was, but they were Christians. How on earth was this possible? How did that compute with what I thought faith was? I saw people like Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, J.P. Morland, William Lane Craig, and others in philosophy offering new arguments and reasons for people who wanted to look into it and who were serious about pursuing the questions. I saw them offering new arguments for people to take God seriously. So I thought I had to be honest about it. So I started to read their books and I started to look at their arguments and to dig into their ideas. And what I had to gradually accept was this: for some people, their belief in God really was reasonable. They were thinking about it and they were being logical and systematic all the way through. Now, up until this point, I would have absolutely viewed faith as a leap in the dark. But if these people had some reasons, some arguments, then perhaps it was more of a step. than a leap. I was, and I remain, completely and deeply committed to being logical, being analytical, being systematic. But as I began to engage with those different reasons and different arguments, the ideas that surrounded belief in God, I was struck by something very interesting about Christian faith in particular. Uniquely, it offered data before a decision. It offered me something to look at, something to think about before I was asked to buy into it. I found out a couple of other things that helped me. That faith in the Bible is defined as being based on events that either did or did not happen. In fact, in a letter between early churches, in a letter called 1 Corinthians in chapter 15, Paul, one of the founders of the early church, writes to another group saying, if this resurrection from the dead, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, if it did not happen as a historical event, then our faith and our preaching and everything is meaningless. But if it did happen, then there is a real hope. So I began to realize that the people who wrote the Gospels were laying out reasons for people to look into it, to have data before a decision. And I also noticed something as I read the stories about Jesus, which I started off thinking were probably made up and were probably legendary and weren't really real. I started to notice that the gospel writers were writing very accurately, something that I saw historians and archaeologists confirming. But I also saw that the way that Jesus interacted with people was that he didn't really ask people just to simply trust him, to leap into the dark and to put their faith in him. Instead, he invited the people who showed an interest to come and see. It's a frequently used phrase in the New Testament, in the Gospels, come and see. So he pointed to the things he was doing as evidence for his direct claims to be God, to be the answer to the question, does God exist? I also discovered that the word faith in the New Testament is translated often from a Greek word, which is the word pistio or pistis. And that Greek word means to be persuaded that the thing that you put your faith in, the object of your faith, is actually real and true. Now, I found this a bit weird at first, for whatever reason, and it seemed a bit unwise to me. How could I process this idea that the Christian God was both, believed in and people were putting arguments for him forward. But then how had this Christian God made himself a hostage to a historical event? It seemed crazy. You could look at that event, and if that event didn't happen, then the whole of the Christian faith was out of the window and God wasn't real in the Christian sense. But actually, that was what I found. That was exactly what the claim was. So that was an opportunity to look at it and to see data before a decision. So I found that Christian faith was not a leap in the dark, but it was a reasonable step into the real and true. Now, sometimes as atheists, as like I used to be, we like to claim that religion is a leap in the dark. Maybe that's a bit of a way of not looking into it sometimes, or of getting rid of it. But I found if you follow the evidence and you look at the data, it's actually a reasonable step into the light. And because it's based on what actually happened, on real things, on facts, on data, that means it's a real hope. It's not a fake or false hope. It's a real hope, a hope that's better than any other hope you can base something on, because it turns out to actually be true when that moment where you need it arrives. So the next step in my journey then was to try to understand what this meant for me. I'd gradually come to see it as a bit reasonable. And then I was being intrigued by the arguments, gradually being persuaded by them. So then I had to answer the question, well, what's it all about? What does it mean? It might be these claims are reasonable and have data with them, but what does it actually mean? So the next step in my journey was finding out what Jesus was trying to communicate by giving us that possibility of a real hope. So I then began to discover that his message was a message of hope through reconnecting with God. He talked about God loving each of us. He said that true faith is not possible without him. And he said that where we really need help is we need forgiveness and we need friendship with God. And that's what the cross is all about. So that's my journey for going through that question. And I think it's a really interesting thing to just open a gospel, to open a Bible around you and just have a look at the Gospel of Luke or Gospel of Mark. They're written to present you with the data and see what you think.
Do you know what? I was gripped. And I know our listeners were as well. Sometimes when you've got guests on, and thankfully on the radio station, it doesn't happen often, but you're sort of looking at the times and thinking, are we going to be able to fit this in? But with that, I was just thinking, I don't really care. I think that this is so important because, especially nowadays with what's going on around the world, we need hope. And that hope, you believe, and I believe, and all our presenters here believe, that comes from Jesus Christ. And yet, world leaders are falling out. They've got some difficult decisions to make, but we know that our leader is the one upstairs. And I do hope, because this is what we're all about here at Connect. In fact, you sum it up, I think, in your career. We're all about not Bible bashing, dare I use that phrase, but we're all about actually looking at the evidence for the Christian faith and saying that this is not something like you said, it's not a leap into the dark. It isn't going, right, I'll pray and everything will be fine and these answers will come. And I'm sure you still have your struggles. Do you still have maybe the odd doubt?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're human and we doubt. And I find that my doubts might be more related to emotional and psychological experiences I'm going through, though, rather than the deep foundations of my faith, which I think are quite secure, although I am open to hearing questions about them. But I've been through a really tough time the last year or so, as many of us have been, and it's thrown up all sorts of questions for me. But if you have some rocks at the base of your faith, some foundations in your hope and under your hope, then it doesn't have to destabilize you. Actually, you can take the knocks and you don't become hopeless. You might have up and down times, but you don't become without hope.
So much love. Tracy said, Tom Price, what a fantastic addition to the radio station. We need to hear more like this about the truth of God. And he puts it in such a plain and simple and understanding way. And Helen says, so gripping from Tom. Thanks so much. And looking forward already to what he brings us in the next few weeks. Just very quickly, Tom, tell us those books of the Bible that you said that are the foundations, and I guess they're offering an insight into the evidence of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, find a Bible, or you can go to a website like BibleGateway.com, or you can download an app on your phone like YouVersion, or there's even an app where you can begin to read little chunks of the Bible every day. Bible in 1 Year app is quite a good one. And just have a look at the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Mark. And as you read it, ask yourself the question, are you real? Did you really do this? Will you speak to me? If you show yourself to me, I'll look, I'll listen, I'll respond. If it's useful, then look up the film on Netflix or on Amazon Prime. There's a film called The Case for Christ, which is the story of a journalist called Lee Strobel, who wrote a book called The Case for Christ. If it's easier, get the book. But have a look at the film, The Case for Christ, if you can. Watch that with some friends or watch it on your own. And you'll find there is much to this journey. And there's actually a whole history and a whole story of people, skeptics, philosophers, archaeologists, historians, quite clever, smart people who have gone to faith and they've been trying to pull it down. And they've been trying to destroy it by pulling away the evidential foundations. And actually what happens is they come back and they actually are convinced. It's the story of Nicky Gumbel. It's the story of Lee Strobel. It's the story of all sorts of detectives, lawyers, barristers, all kinds of interesting people who are trained in looking at argument and evidence. And so that should lead a reasonable person to say, maybe there's something to this. Maybe I should have a look. Maybe I should read Luke or Mark's Gospel.
I'm sure you're a very busy man, but can we just ask you a few more things? Because listeners are sending through messages. One from actually Mark says, can you ask, please, Tom, what it was like? Because he mentioned that his journey to Christ, it was reading the work of people like John Lennox. Now, I've looked at Tom, and he's now working with those people. What's it like to actually meet them and to be working alongside them?
So John's really a very humble man, and John is not, he doesn't confer or behave in a way that would give you the impression that he thinks he's any more than just you or me, just a normal person. I'm going to be working this Friday with Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, doing some events. And I was at an event a couple of weeks ago where he was asked a question, do I have to call you by your big title? And he knows, I mean, the title's amazing for the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he's, and then I think a teenager had added a question on the end of this and had said, are you just a guy? And he said, well, my whole title is this. And then he gave a really funny, witty answer. But then at the end of that, he said, but I am just a guy who's loved by a God, who's blessed, who's forgiven by Jesus. And so there's a real leveler that if where faith is real, then we're all the same in front of him.
And so I've met him, Justin Welby, very briefly, and he was doing an outside baptism in my local area. And what was interesting is that he could have easily have avoided difficult questions and difficult situations because, as you know, he's got an entourage, which he has to have for his own protection. And it was in this local village called Glossop, and there must have been, I'm guessing, 2,500 people there. And he arrived, and there was protests from the LGBT community. And they were raising placards. Now, he could have easily have avoided that. And he could have just gone on the stage, done the stuff, and off he went again. And this was about 6-7 years ago, maybe not that long. But I remember he purposely made a beeline for these people, and not in a nasty way, not to say, what are you doing here? But he went to approach them to just, I guess, speak to them and to show them love and to find out where they're coming from. And what was really, really interesting is that the mood completely changed from one that had a bit of tension there to one that had the whole area just there in this celebration. And you gradually saw these big rainbow banners and these placards coming down. And then he went back, did his thing. He went again. I interviewed him. And it has to be said, he was a really lovely man.
I think there's something disarming about talking and listening. So often, I think in life, we don't feel really listened to. We've often got the answer to what somebody's saying or asking, or what we think they're asking. We've often got the answer prepared before they even finish speaking. And that sometimes is a sign that we're not really listening to what they're saying. Mm. The times when I've felt most valued and have been most significant for me in my life, and I would dare say this is probably true for others as well, are the times where I've been really listened to. The early church and the early Christians were not in a they didn't separate themselves out of the world, but they engaged with where people were. They listened to their questions. They took them seriously. And Paul would go to the synagogue and he would listen to the questions that the Jewish Hebrew people had, and he would go to the marketplaces to listen to the Gentile questions, and he would engage with them, and those discussions would be based around him listening, him finding out where they were. In fact, when he started to speak to the community in Athens in ancient Greece, and you'll find this story in Acts chapter 17, it was evident that he had really listened and looked at their culture very carefully. He'd understood what they were living for. He understood their concerns in the world. And I think that actually some of what we need to do is to just listen and find out where we are, where other people are. And I think it's sometimes if we did a bit more listening, then maybe when we speak, it would be a bit more connected up. One of my heroes is a guy called Francis Schaeffer. He's passed away now, but he was an American missionary who was sent to Europe. And during the course of his being sent to Europe, he actually lost his faith. And he spent some time pacing around in a hayloft in a chalet in Switzerland. And eventually out of that came a desire to base his faith on real things and true things. And out of that grew an amazing movement, an amazing group of thinking Christians called L'Abri. I used to go and spend time at L'Abri when I was studying to help me with some of my questions, and still do sometimes, actually. I've been in the last year or two, and it's been helpful to me, as I still do have questions. But he said once, if he had an hour to talk to somebody, he would spend 55 minutes of that hour and the first 55 minutes asking questions and listening. And then at 5 minutes at the end, he might feel like he could speak to where they really were. I think that would change the world if we engage with each other anyway, religious or not. If we engage with each other by listening that intently to where people are coming from, hearing the heart stuff, what's going on underneath, what are people really worried about, what are they scared of, what are they afraid of, what are they trying to prove, what are they worried about? If we can get to some of that, then we really answer heart questions, and that changes the world, I think, especially if you introduce them to a hope that's real and a person that's real.
Do you remember on our original emails where I said, don't worry, it will only take up about 6 minutes of your time? So I can only apologize, but this is such interesting stuff. Now, can you answer this question in about 30 seconds? Because today is Ash Wednesday, and some people have said, I don't know what Ash Wednesday is. I know I had pancakes last night. Is that anything to do with Ash? Can you please ask Tom whilst he's there? So, Tom, in the quickest answer that you've ever done, Ash Wednesday. Oh, I think he's Googling. What's it all about?
So yeah, you're right. You caught me Googling. I'm not by tradition a massively, like I'm not particularly denominational, and Ash Wednesday is generally celebrated by some denominations as a holy day of prayer and fasting, and it's the beginning of Lent. It's the beginning of a period where we're beginning to reflect and think about who we are and what we're like before a holy God. And that's the key thing. Is we can think of God as powerful and big. We can think of God as amazingly creative and scientific and artistic when we look at sunsets, or we look at the world through the tools of science. But I think Ash Wednesday and this beginning of this period of Lent is the preparation, the slow preparation of contemplation, where we're saying, if you're there, if you're holy, if you're utterly clean and spotless and pure, if you're utterly holy, utterly righteous, then are there things in me that need cleaning up and making new? And that actually takes us back to my story, because for me, what happened after I'd begun to discover that this wasn't a leap in the dark, that it was actually about this loving reconnection with God, that this forgiveness and this friendship with God was possible through what Jesus had done on the cross. I actually knelt down in my room. I didn't really know any other Christians. And I put my hands out and I prayed, I think you're there. I had my kind of eyes open. I didn't know the rules about praying, because I was just praying a really normal kind of honest, I think you're there, but I think you're pure and I think you're holy. And I know I'm not. I know I'm not holy. I know I'm not pure. I know that if I encountered you as a holy being, I would need forgiveness. Please forgive me. Please wash me. Please clean me. That's the prayer of Ash Wednesday and of Lent, is wash me, clean me, forgive me, make me new.
Absolutely love it. Well, Tom, it has been such a pleasure to meet you, first of all, and we're really excited to have you on future weeks. Now, again, if you've got a question that you'd like us to put to Tom, maybe you've got a struggle in your faith at the moment and you know something, I hope it's come across from Tom and me that there's no there's nothing to be ashamed of if you've got questions about your faith, and we'll always be a radio station for everybody. And that doesn't mean that we've got this Christian bubble and we daren't ask questions. Some of the listeners will be Christian, some of them won't, some of them will be asking the questions. Well, this is the place to come. It's a safe place for you to ask those questions. And we want to give you good people like Tom who can answer those questions, because I can't. So if you've got any of those big questions and you'd like them answering for next week or future shows, just send them over. studio@connectradio.com. Thank you very much, Tom. You're a blessing, and we'll have you on next week.
Thanks for having me.